Good afternoon, everybody. I see we have a little under 30 people popped in so far, but we had well over 150 people registered, so I'll give it a few more seconds to let Zoom do its thing and let folks in, and we'll get started here in just a minute. All right, well, it's 2 after, so we'll go ahead and get this webinar kicked off. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's a pleasure to get together virtually for another xChat in our series on innovation that we call Housing X. My name is Jonathan Knopf. I am the Executive Director for Programs here at Housing Forward. We're very happy to have some really talented, really creative thinking people who are pushing the envelope on this issue about rethinking the way that we design buildings. What are we doing wrong and what can we do better? And this really fits into our work to try to make housing and housing affordability more accessible as a topic through education, policy work, data work, and everything that falls under that bucket. Which is what you know Housing Forward as. And if you haven't gotten to know our organization, I encourage you to visit our website afterwards, or at least in the next day or so, because we'll definitely have all of the materials and slides and information from today posted. So you don't have to take screenshots or anything. We'll make sure everything from today is up there. And so why are we talking about this issue in the first place? Why are we focused on stairs? What are point access blocks? I'm not the right person to answer that question, but obviously other folks here are that you'll hear from. But I've been at the Roanoke Regional Housing Symposium yesterday. I'm here at the conference for the Virginia Association of Housing and Community Development officials in beautiful Norfolk on the waterfront today. And I think one theme that I've started to uncover is that we've made a lot of great progress in the past few years on talking about housing, educating people about the need for affordable housing and better communities across the board. And so that means that we're starting to uncover some new issues that we just didn't have the time or capacity to even consider or think about. And so now we're at the point where we're looking at all of the new construction that we're building, the units that we need to add to our market to correct this historic undersupply across the whole housing spectrum. And we're kind of scratching our head about the way some of these things look and wondering what is creating these very similar looking 5/1s in buildings that really don't quite match some of the older, more character driven buildings and neighborhoods and forms that we, may feel more comfortable with or may feel like are more of a neighborhood that's higher quality and lends itself better to community participation and all sorts of great things like that. So with that said, I want to thank all of our supporters for this work, particularly Virginia Housing and many others. We hope this is just one of many conversations on this topic and related ones that we have over the coming years. And so I have the great privilege to hand this off to our moderator, Catherine Williams, for the day. She is an award-winning architect, a community developer, and writer, among many other things. And so, Catherine, without any further delay, I will hand it off to you to tell us more about yourself and get this event going. So it is all yours. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Happy to have you all here and happy to be here. And thanks for the invitation from Housing Forward. So yeah, as Jonathan said, I'm an architect. I'm currently in the Northern Virginia, DC area, working for a university more as an owner's rep, but I have a background in affordable housing and community development. And I'm a native Virginian, grew up in the Richmond area, Chesterfield, outside of Richmond. So very much interested in housing issues and how affordable housing and housing in general as a larger topic is happening in the state and in that area in particular. I was the AIA Housing and Community Development Knowledge Community, which is a group of architects who are focused a lot on housing policy and tracking housing around the country. I was chair of that group back in 2015 and have stayed sort of involved in housing issues and policy around the country. So today we have two speakers with us to talk about the Single-Stair and that as a topic and how changing building codes could help affordability. And we will start with Mike, who comes to us from the Larch Lab, Michael Ellison, who's an architect and founder of that firm. So I will let you get started, Michael.
So we're just doing introductions first, right? For the run of the show, or am I sharing slides?
Yeah, just introductions.
Okay, sorry. Michael Eliasson, I'm the founder of Larch Lab, an architect in Seattle. Spent a couple of years working in Germany, in Freiburg, and in Bavaria. And in that time frame, came to realize that the way that we design buildings is completely different than the way that buildings and housing are planned in Europe and other countries. And so today, really just kind of digging into some of the technical details, what it entails in terms of quality of life and climate adaptation, and looking down at the small scale and large scale as well. And I will let Ed, I will hand it over to you.
Yes. So our second speaker today is Eduardo Mendoza, who's the policy director at Livable Communities Initiative. So Ed, if you could give us a brief introduction.
Hi, everybody. Sure. I'm Ed Mendoza. I'm the policy director of the Livable Communities Initiative. A little bit of background of me. I'm a planner by training. I've worked in the cities of LA and Culver City. I've also dipped my feet into the realm of academia and demography with a population dynamics research group where I wrote a couple briefs on the effects of gentrification, displacement in different areas in California and the United States. And yeah, very, very happy to be here.
Thanks, Ed. So for today, each speaker will present for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will have time for audience Q&A. We ask everyone to please use the Q&A tab. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a Q&A tab where you can post questions. We will be gathering those questions during the presentations, and then we will try to get to as many as we have time for at the end of the presentations. And so with that, I will hand it off to Mike, who will share your screen and bring up the presentation. Thank you.
Mike, I don't think we can hear you.
Apologies, I muted myself. So today, we're going to talk about unlocking family-friendly housing, livable housing, more climate-adaptive housing with point access blocks. So in Seattle and the West Coast and much of the US, we have this really strange bifurcated urbanism where we focus a lot of density downtown, and then we'll put density on arterials, and then immediately fall away to detached houses, townhouses. It's just kind of rare in the rest of the world. It's not a very effective way of dealing with housing costs, affordability. And in the back of my mind, Larch Lab, we're dealing with climate adaptation, decarbonized buildings, looking at how we do land use and how we design housing. This is a new light rail station in Seattle. It's surrounded by a couple of multifamily buildings, but then immediately drops away to detached houses. There are no cooperatives. There's very little social housing. There's not a lot of open space. So in thinking about how I worked on projects in eco districts as an architect in Germany, and how we're doing things here, how we're planning here, it was kind of wildly different. And I started to think about, some of these patterns, right? These development patterns that you find in not just traditional European architecture, but also in South America, in Asia, in modern development, modern districts in Europe as well. There's kind of there's more open space. There's this fine-grained development. It goes on for blocks and blocks. There's more space for blue-green infrastructure. And a lot of our historic districts, we have these really narrow lots with one-story, two-story commercial buildings that have existed for like 100 years. But when they get redeveloped, developers will come in and pull together several parcels. They'll do assemblage and then do these huge, ginormous 5/1 buildings. This really isn't commonplace in the rest of the world. And if we go back and look at something like this is Frederiksberg in Copenhagen, right? These are all really small buildings, right? How do they get this fineness? So how is this possible if they're not doing 2 stairs per building? So they're not just thinner buildings, they're also taller buildings. Like I said, the 5/1 is atypical in the rest of the world, but this is really the modern form of development. Almost everything in Seattle now is really headed in this direction, huge projects taking up a whole block. We'll play games, we'll do modulation to try to make it look less bulky and massive than it is, but there's really no effective way to do that. You know, another way to think about this is the way that we're planning our buildings has effects on climate adaptation. So can our buildings cross-ventilate? They have an effect on energy consumption. Do we have daylight on multiple sides? Can those buildings be utilized for more than just residences? Are there opportunities to bring in more uses, a mix of uses? The double-loaded corridor doesn't really have that flexibility ingrained into it. So this is the standard form of development, corridor down the middle, 2 or more stairs, connecting all of the units. These end up being really small units. It's really difficult to get family-sized units in a building like this, especially in areas with high construction costs, high land costs, because you're looking at a 3-bedroom unit effectively taking up the space of 3 studio units or 4 studio units. And so it's the economies of scale aren't really working out. It's really development by Excel spreadsheet. No opportunities for cross ventilation. If you live on an arterial on this side of the building, let's say this is the street, your bedroom really can't get away from that noise. You can't get away from the air pollution. So there are public health effects with the way that we plan our buildings as well. And this is just a project here in the Northwest. Again, double-loaded corridor. It's all studios. It's really only at the corners that you have those opportunities to do more than studio or 1-bedroom units. Another option, it's really common in Switzerland and Germany, the single-loaded corridor. You just have your corridor on the outside or on the edge of the building. It could be interior, it could be exterior, but it does allow for cross ventilation. It does allow for a little bit more variability in how we're planning our units, our housing. The efficiency of these floor plates aren't as high as you would see with double-loaded corridors, and so they're not really utilized in a lot of development. There are some really interesting projects in Canada that are utilizing this on a larger scale, but it's still, I think there's a stigma associated with it, so we don't see it very often. This is a single-loaded corridor project in Austria by 1&1. But the point access block is really the single-stair building. It's the workhorse of urban buildings the world over, whether it's traditional, whether it's new, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Mexico City, Paris, Zurich. It is ubiquitous, except for in the United States. And there are a number of reasons for this. But this is a super efficient floor plan. I've seen plans that get up to 95, 96% efficient. It's compact, which is great for embodied carbon. It's great for reducing operational carbon and operational energy consumption. It allows for units that can cross-ventilate. It allows for daylight on multiple sides, or to put the bedrooms on the quiet side of the building. Now, Seattle has an interesting history with this. The International Building Code allows single-stair buildings up to 3 stories. In 1977, our building code, which was at the time the UBC, the Universal Building Code, effectively allowed unlimited height, maximum of 4 stories per unit. And then the stairway had to be either smoke-proof, so concrete, or exterior. In the 80s, that was reduced down to 6 floors. They brought in more conditions, but effectively today, this is still allowed. We can do 5- and 6-story single-stair buildings everywhere in the city. 4 units per floor. It's got to be sprinklered. We have requirements on distances, travel distances, fire ratings, and things of that nature. What's really interesting is that I just helped get a bill at the state level so that the rest of the state could adopt this through modifications at the state building code, not just the city of Seattle. Now, these are legal in Virginia, but only up to 3 stories. Again, here's our magic number, 4 dwelling units per floor. It has to be sprinklered. There are other conditions as well, travel distance. Just a kind of a typical project that you would see, maybe 2 or 4 units, generally around a stairway. When I went to school in Virginia Tech, this is the exact sort of housing that we lived in. There's a central stairway that was open, combined all units on the 3 floors, and then we all of the units were 2-floor units, cross-ventilating, daylight on multiple sides, and fairly livable for being in a kind of a dense environment. But there's this question in the back of my mind. Does fire burn differently in the US and Canada that it does in the rest of the world? Canada's one of the most strictest when it comes to this issue. It's really an anomaly in the US as well, but almost everywhere else allows 5, 6, or even more stories. of single-stair buildings. And there are other conditions, generally heavy construction, concrete, mass timber, masonry. So, 3 stories, this is the max for most of the US. 5, 6 stories, this is the max for Seattle, as well as New York City. In Germany and Switzerland, where I was operating, it's up to 60 meters on a single stair. By the way, that's not sprinklered. Sprinklers are uncommon almost everywhere in the EU for multifamily housing until you get to high rises. And so there's this weird condition where we're requiring so much additional effort without getting, I think, a lot of gain in that. So we're sprinkling our buildings. We're doing fire-rated assemblies on our buildings. We're incorporating travel access distances. These are all things that other countries will take like maybe 2 of, but they'll get better outcomes. So Switzerland, all of their buildings, concrete, most of them are single stair. You can go high rise, single stair, unsprinklered. Their fire death rate is significantly lower than ours. And so what are some of these benefits? Like I said, you can have light on up to 3 sides of a unit. If you're in modern construction these days, especially in Seattle, where 95% of our units are studios and double loaded corridors, you get windows on one side. That side is usually on a street or it's facing another unit 15 to 20 feet away. You don't have opportunities for cross ventilation. You can't put the bedrooms on the quiet side of the street. It really doesn't induce these larger units. So this is a project in Switzerland. Got a 1-bedroom unit here and then 3-bedroom units on the end. So there's more diversity on kind of the single level. And so what does this look like on a larger building? Well, typically they'll take single stair buildings and string them together. This is a really elegant Baugruppe in Berlin by a number of architects. And then this is Mies van der Rohe in Detroit. If I highlight the circulation spaces, you see that this is a lot more compact. There's more diversity in these buildings. There's a 1-bedroom here. There's a 3-bedroom here. There's a 4-bedroom here. Most of the bedrooms are positioned on the quieter side of the building. If we go back to the Mies building, there's no opportunity for cross ventilation in any of these units. There's not a lot of variability. There aren't a lot of large units. And so it's this kind of this social and economic mixing that isn't really happening in these buildings. And like I said, they'll take this building, they'll divide it up into kind of smaller buildings. Each one has its own core, each one has its own elevator. And this is pretty typical for most of Europe, whether that's new buildings or old buildings. And so what are some of the knock-on effects of this? Well, a big one is you could get the same number of bedrooms in significantly less space. So we looked at just kind of a typical section of a point access block in a double loaded corridor, trying to get the same number of bedrooms. And the point access block ends up being about 1,000 square feet lower. So there's less construction costs. There's less embodied carbon associated with that. There's less envelope costs, right? And so these savings start to knock on in really interesting ways. This is a couple of floor plans for a study I did for a colleague of mine. 2-bedroom unit in the US. In Seattle, we have them up to 1,400 square feet, but generally about 1,000 square feet. And if you count the circulation space for that as well, the double loaded corridor, that's kind of about what you would get for a 3-bedroom unit. So we're building much larger units, and the quality of living in those units is radically different than when you would find in almost any other country. And you can go really big on this. This is a really elegant project by Weber Brunner and Sopelsa and Winterthur, the Sioux and Till, 4 to 6 story connected point access blocks, mass timber. I'm pretty sure it's not even sprinklered either. And if I highlight all of the stair cores there, right? These are 20 elevators and 20 stair cores, each with a handful of units operating out of it. So if this were the US, this building would be significantly thicker. It's only about 38, 40 feet deep for this building. In Seattle, our floor plates are approaching 80, 90 feet. So your courtyards would be smaller. You wouldn't have units that can cross ventilate. You wouldn't have the diversity of unit sizes that you see here. And so it's a radically different way of living, I think. Instead of having one corridor connecting this entire building with lots of small units and hundreds of people that you don't really ever see in a day, you have a couple of people on your floor. You can run across the street or run across the corridor and say hi to your colleagues or borrow tea or sugar. And it's a much more compact way of living. This is a City of Vancouver is really kind of the initiative or the initiator for why Large Lab started. They asked me to talk about this for some of their projects and to help facilitate discussions on allowing taller point access blocks in Vancouver and BC. At the time, they were only limited to 2 stories, and now there's a process to get a code mod to allow it to 6. Taking a mass timber passive house social housing project, it's a corridor wrapped around a courtyard, so all of these units can cross ventilate. Basically took that concept and said, look, if this were kind of this European-inspired, German-inspired point access block building, connected point access blocks, what would that look like? What are the differences? Same number of units, similar sized units. Most of the units can cross ventilate. But what was really interesting to me is that you get significantly less circulation space. You have significantly less FAR utilized. So our building costs are going down significantly. There's less envelope area. So our buildings are not only cheaper, they're also more compact. Energy efficiency is associated with that. Our embodied carbon goes down significantly. And if we start to look at the thermal envelope overlays of this building, the open space, the opportunities for open space on lots become even larger. Taking this concept and looking at a project in Hamburg and a project in Seattle, very similar size buildings, very similar number of units. This one is more family-sized units and more family-sized units and fewer bathrooms and kitchens. The US-based building, it's almost all studios. Each studio has its own bathroom, it has its own kitchen. So it's significantly more expensive building. Oh, and by the way, the floor plate is also significantly larger. When we overlay those two floor plates and look at the differences and the costs associated with that, there's about a $4.5 million difference between the German building and the Seattle building. And if we multiply that over 6 floors, so that's $28 million. That's not an insignificant amount of money. Now, granted, this isn't allowed in the US right now, hoping that we can change that. But this is something that I think that we should be focusing on. This is really the next step beyond talking about missing middle housing. This is kind of that next level, that mid-rise, that missing mid-rise that is ubiquitous the world over, outside of New York and a couple of other places in the US. Just a couple of examples. This is a really elegant social housing project in Paris, Haussmann Paris, really small building, postage size parcel. Here's the stair core. If this had to have 2 stairs, you're not getting the number of units that you did in this building. You're not getting the size of the units in this building. So this has studios all the way up to 3 bedrooms. So you wouldn't have that that amount of housing in this. And so your optimization of this building, of this parcel, would really be significantly lower. And this, for me, is one of the key things that I think is really interesting about point access blocks, is that it allows this these smaller lots to really be utilized in ways that they couldn't be under our current code. This is another really elegant project. This is the Capitol Hill Urban Co-Housing by Schemata here in Seattle. Mixed-use building, ground floor is Schemata's architecture studio, and then co-housing above, centered around this open courtyard. Family-sized units, 2 bedrooms with studios. It's got 1 stair. It's very open, and so you're kind of constantly running into your neighbors. It's a radically different way of living than you would find in most development here in the US today. Another project in Seattle that I find really intriguing, this is a 6-story wood frame project for Habitat for Humanity. Units from studios all the way up to 3-bedroom units on a 4,000 square foot lot. Now, the urbanism of this drives me nuts. I think this is a really horrific way to plan cities, but this does allow us to bring more family-sized units, more affordable units in places that those kinds of homes don't exist. In our own work here at Large Lab, we're looking at utilizing connected point access blocks in Seattle. We're limited to 2 conditions of that on a wide parcel. It's not very deep, utilizing a combination of maisonette units, so 2-floor units, and flats to get all 2- and 3-bedroom units. So if we look at how this would traditionally be done, it would all be studios, maybe something a little bit larger at the corners, no cross ventilation. These units here on the loud side of the street do not ever get away from the loud side of the street. But if we flip that, if we start to say, look, this isn't a really smart way of developing, this isn't how development should be occurring for a number of reasons: climate, livability, quality of life, keeping families in the city. How can we change that up? And so we're looking at doing 2- and 3-bedroom units. They're all flats above the 2nd floor, having an adequate number of bathrooms. All of these units can cross ventilate. Here's our stair core. Here's our stair core. The bedrooms can all be positioned on the quieter side of the street, on the courtyard. We're not looking directly into another building 10 to 14 feet away, which is kind of what tends to happen with a lot of these buildings in Seattle. And so there are really different ways of how we start to inhabit our buildings. And of course, we're trying to do mass timber and passive house and kind of incorporate a lot of these things that are kind of at our ethos into this building as well. But when we start to scale out, what does this development look like at a larger scale? The status quo, there's not a lot of opportunities for open space. There's not a lot of diversity. This entire block was remodeled, and they'll painted different colors and use slightly different materials and try to pretend that it's not the same building, but it is. And the floor plates are significantly thicker, and there's a density associated with these that I think is actually kind of antithetical to more livability, to having kind of more climate adaptive and quiet urban environments. But it doesn't have to be that way. This is Munich. This is the Prince Eugene Park. These are all point access blocks. Even the buildings, the perimeter block style buildings over here. These are point access block row. These are point access blocks. These are row houses. So this is radical mixing, not just in type of homes, but also unit types and unit sizes and affordability. This part is social housing. These are market rate homes. So this is really radical mixing that's kind of going on. Of course, there's opportunities for open space. There's connection to transit. There's a tram line here, climate adaptive neighborhoods. And they're going even larger. This is Domag Park. Again, it's the same thing. It's this climate adaptive park. It's point access blocks galore. There's a school. It's connected to tram. It's a radically different way of thinking about how it can be developing communities where people can thrive and adapt to a changing climate. Like I said, even at the building scale, there's this weird thing going on where we don't have a lot of opportunities for green. We don't have a lot of opportunities in inducing, I think, more livable places. Everything is still auto-centric. It's really difficult to get away from that. But you can still have cars. You can still have the same kinds of mobility options as we do in the States and other countries, but do it in ways that are maybe more humane and safer for your kids to run around and cross the street and things of that nature. So in the back of my mind, there's this overarching question. How are our codes affecting quality of life? You know, the double-loaded corridor, for me, The Shining is like the perfect embodiment of what it's like. And if you have young kids, if you have dementia, there are additional hurdles associated with that as well. But what if our stairways were communicative? What if they were open? This is a Baugruppe. This is effectively co-housing in Vienna. All of the units open directly onto this stair. It's the only stair in the building. It's got a skylight up above, so it's daylit. In COVID, they can come into this space, open the skylight, open the doors, they'd have good ventilation and celebrate each other, celebrate their birthdays, opportunities to run into each other. And these are opportunities that really don't exist with the kind of paradigm that we find ourselves in with our building codes and our land use codes. And so if we look at this building or this development, this is the Neckarbogen development in Heilbronn, you know, there's something weird about this. These are not all the same building. This is one building. This is another building. This is another building. So each one of these blocks is made up of these small buildings. They're all point access blocks. This is a 10-story mass timber building. This is workforce housing. This is a Baugruppe. This is social housing. So you get this radical mixing at the block level that really we aren't going to ever get with these massive 5/1 developments. And we can try to integrate them, but you know, success isn't very high in those projects. And we're not getting a good mixing from the social and economic aspect. There's not a lot of family-friendly homes in this. So for me, like, this is ideal where we can start to get to the way that we should be developing and the things that we should be seeing if we start to rethink the way that we're doing our building codes. And so that's why I've been talking about this on and off for the last 18 months. And with that, I am finished. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Michael. While Ed queues up, I will just remind you, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And Ed, if you're ready to get started, I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, 1 second. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay. All right. Am I ready to go? Does everything look good?
Yep.
All right, great. Okay, so hello, everyone. Again, my name is Ed Mendoza. I'm the policy director with the Lowell Communities Initiative, and thank you for having me here today to speak to you about the positive effects of stairway reform. Before I begin speaking about all the ways single-stair layouts help buildings, I'd like to first briefly give you a little bit of context about us, who we are, and what we're advocating for. The Lowell Communities Initiative is an housing advocacy group that advocates for multiple reforms in housing and transportation. Our housing niche is centered on improving upon the built form of our mixed-use multifamily construction and advancing goals such as greater accessibility, affordability, and resiliency in new development. Our group is composed of various experts in the field of housing and transportation, professors, senior planners, as well as community leaders and organizers. And lately, our group has been achieving significant success in forming alliances with different stakeholders and mobilizing individuals who previously had, maybe mixed feelings about housing policy or didn't really want to, venture too much into them, but now have become much more involved in the area. We try to meet people where they are and address concerns when they are made in good faith. So after meeting with a whole lot of stakeholders, homeowner groups, renters, policymakers, we've come to center our focus on addressing some key issues in contemporary building policy. These first three cover building intensity, aesthetics, and affordability. So in terms of building intensity, we look at how new large developments may impact established neighborhoods and replace the granularity of smaller neighborhood serving sites with significantly larger developments. Aesthetics usually come up as a concern, as many people are annoyed with what some refer to as developer modern in new developments, and also the presence of parking podiums that may disrupt street life and disrupt the eyes on the street concept, Jane Jacobs. And affordability and the target market for new housing is also a significant point of debate. When speaking to policymakers, these three issues usually are the ones that come up. First is our sites that cannot be developed because they may be too small, or the housing market may not support profitable development on these sites. The second is the issue with overparked building in TOD transit-oriented designed areas, and developers not wanting to go that extra step in truly creating transit-oriented development. And lastly, the prevalence of windowless bedrooms and somewhat lack of unit layout variation in new development. So our plan has come up to address some of these topics and concerns by looking into ways to promote and encourage new methods of construction, utilizing best practices, both nationally and internationally. We advocate for policies that incentivize granular parcel by parcel development. We look into ways that promote architecturally rich housing. We advocate to develop housing that is parking free or parking light as mechanisms to lower rent and increase transit use. And finally, we try to tie everything together with mobility infrastructure improvements to facilitate this process. So that was a little bit of an overview of the LCI and who we are. And now I'm going to talk about why I'm here today and how we found that single-stair reform will be instrumental in changing how we build, not only in Southern California, but potentially the United States. So a big challenge in Los Angeles, and I'm guessing a lot of metro areas, is finding how we could leverage out more builders and more players in the market, and how we could unlock more places to build. In LA, land tends to be incredibly expensive, and typically if you want to develop, you also have to assemble land as well. Assembling land in LA, believe it or not, is also incredibly expensive. Land assembly premiums normally reach up to 40%, and so that creates a barrier to housing construction. That is to say, currently the bulk of infill multifamily developers in LA tend to be well capitalized, so they can afford the costs of land assembly or any cost inefficiency that contemporary building brings. So issues regarding land assembly may not be, on the forefront or an immediate pressing problem with them. However, the same cannot be said for smaller developers or contractors attempting to move up the value chain. These are people who build ADUs up to fourplexes. These could be homeowners or small commercial property owners. They could be community land trust or mission-driven affordable housing developers where land assembly poses a significant barrier. That is to say that there are ways to build housing on some of our larger parcels in the city. However, the trade-offs are significant and definitely impact the livability and frequency of new development on such sites. Here are some examples of single parcel construction in LA. You'll see a common theme in all of these layouts. There's a corridor spine that runs through all the units. Units tend to be small, lack variety, have windowless bedroom layouts, and have access to only one side of light. Lack of cross ventilation creates an over-dependence on air conditioners versus passive cooling, so that drives up some costs. Staircases also eat up space on the front of the building, so it forces units to look to the side of the building. And having the staircases up at front also makes it very difficult to fit commercial space on the ground floor, severely limiting the availability or the possibility to create, I don't know, resilient mixed use development. Unit proximity to adjacent properties is also very tight. So if you live on the second floor in one of these buildings and an adjacent building goes up, you're out of luck with getting sunlight. You kind of see it in this building already. This has both profound political and fiscal impacts. So developers may refuse to build on lots other than corner lots facing the street because they may fear that, if a building on a site that is mid-block, their units will devalue once an adjacent building goes up, blocking, views and light. And residents may also justifiably fight new adjacent housing if it means that their source of light and air will be taken away. It's also pretty bad in terms of open green space. These side yards are about 3 to 5 feet, so you can't really do much in these spaces. However, the existing building code necessitates the need for these side yard setbacks. Otherwise, these buildings would have no reliable source of light. So this is a little bit summary of what I just mentioned. Go back. All right, so should we give up on single lot development given the drawbacks that I just stated? Should we try to focus only on larger style development patterns? Would it even be possible to make something livable on smaller pieces of land? Well, while we recognize that single-stair reform is not a silver bullet or a panacea in housing, it sure helps a whole lot in how a building can be developed and completely challenges long-held standards and beliefs in our built form and environment. With a single-stair layout, units are no longer forced to face the side of a building. Therefore, a side yard is no longer technically necessary. And if one were to eliminate a side yard requirement, the options of building layouts increases dramatically. For example, the area typically used for the placement of the first and second staircases, which are located at the front and rear of the buildings, in addition to the side yard setbacks, could be repurposed to allow additional units that face the street. All the space dedicated to a narrow side yard slot along the periphery of a building can be consolidated onto usable central courtyards to provide green open space. And all of this whilst not giving up on square footage or floor usage efficiency. All or majority of units could be capable of providing multiple angles of sunlight and air circulation. And the distance, something that Mike mentioned, the distance between opposing unit windows looking at each other also increases significantly from the status quo of maybe 6 feet to up to 25 feet now with single stair reform. In addition, because you're also saving on hallway space, building efficiency is also higher. You're allowed more rentable square footage, and different types of unit bed bath configurations with light are now possible. Units share less neighbors, acoustic privacy between units is improved, and again, all units have significantly higher degrees of light and air. In this drawing, we have a layout that has roughly the same density as the buildings being built today in Los Angeles. However, it comes with a bonus that it also holds a significant increase in rentable square footage, area per floor, as well as higher building efficiencies. So you get more bang for your buck as a developer. Another issue we have in Los Angeles is on sites where land is very expensive and where existing businesses are also very successful. If land assembly is impossible or very difficult for a developer, we usually won't get any housing built. If a landowner decides that they want to build on their land, today it's incredibly difficult to facilitate construction due to our rules that favor and are kind of tailored towards land assembly and your typical 5/1 development. However, again, single-stair opens the ability to modify buildable density and design standards to facilitate the construction of relatively dense buildings. This building floor plate still maintains an acceptable density of 170 dwelling units an acre, whilst maintaining light and air attributes from the drawing of the larger site from the previous slide. This is a very small site. This is only 2,500 square feet. And today it would be impossible to build on it, besides maybe one or two large floor plate units or some type of maybe SRO or co-living configuration. Single-stair reform, along with strategic changes in our planning, development, design standards, would allow us to build 16 units on such a constrained site. Side by side, the right being the single loaded layout, and the single stair layout facilitates 3 to 4 times the density and almost twice the amount of rentable square footage on such a limited site. And it's funny, I'm talking like we're inventing something new, but as Michael has demonstrated in his presentation, there are plenty of examples of building layouts like this here in the US and abroad that have applied the advantages of a single stair layout. This one's in Seattle. This one's Seattle to the left and Paris social housing to the right. The one on the right has 15 spacious units on only 1,800 square feet. Amazing, right? These are some more examples. All right, so on to building aesthetics. Because single stair projects specialize in granular development, standardized facades that utilize one particular style begin to make a little bit more sense. Today, many planning departments utilize tricks to break the massing of a building. A developer may be required to apply 3 or 4 different cladding materials to their facades to articulate and simulate multiple buildings. This practice becomes redundant in single stair buildings as you get the real deal. And historically, many major cities in the world have built this way, Paris and Vienna being major historical examples of this. And this is also great with getting neighbors on board with housing. One concern we always hear about is the, I guess, ugly and bland nature of new construction. Plenty of people hate parking podiums and the fake articulation that is forced upon new buildings. And I know I get the ire of architects for this, but looking forward and creating catalogs of pre-approved facades in local jurisdictions really activates neighbors and allows them to have a higher level of participation with them supporting designs from our best architects, and that in turn facilitates support for housing overall. Europe has a history with building competitions that allow for some beautiful looking buildings, and I believe that we could definitely reach something very similar to what they have. And one last thing is it also lessens the effect of visual blight that hyper value engineered buildings may bring over time, again to the ire of some developers this time, but this is something I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So one last topic worth bringing up is a side effect of existing second means of egress stairway requirements and what some developers do to avoid them altogether. As you all might know, there are building codes for different types of buildings and occupancy uses. For those who do not know, a 1 or 2 unit building has a building code that is separate from larger multifamily construction. This 1 or 2 unit code is typically reserved for single family homes, townhomes, duplexes, and has a more relaxed take on single means of egress and requirements for a single staircase. To the left is a type of development that is usually found in lower markets and working class areas in Los Angeles that utilizes this single family building code. This is known as the double duplex. This style of development is typically composed of 2 separate 3 to 4 story tall buildings with units measuring roughly upwards of 2,000 square feet. Units will typically feature 4 to 5 bedrooms apiece with bathrooms and kitchenettes per bedroom. And while the units may rent for $6,000 or $7,000, developers will subdivide the units by the bedroom and then rent the bedrooms for, say, $1,100, $1,200, $1,300. And, you know, smaller developers and contractors will build these structures to get around multifamily building code. And this often comes to the detriment of ADA accessibility. It also comes to the detriment of weaker fire life and safety standards. These are typically type 5B construction. And on the policy side, it also leads to a lack of on-site covenanted affordable housing, and you know, a whole lot of issues, such as, you know, developers choosing not to completely densify a parcel if their, you know, cost benefit says that, you know, this double duplex makes a little bit more sense due to their ease of permitting. Here are some examples of how they are leased out. Again, it's 4 units, but they're leased out by the bedroom at $1,200. And here's a floor plan of them. Again, you know, the unit, it's just bedrooms, and, you know, I'm not saying they're bad, and, you know, they do fulfill a role in our housing market in Los Angeles, but I wouldn't consider it, you know, the best that we could do, or you know, outright, you know, morally ethical that we essentially relegate our working class people to buildings that do not have the same levels of ADA accessibility and fire protection as your standard multifamily construction. But they're very popular. You'll see them all throughout Los Angeles, and you know, they got the ire of a lot of politicians. They're trying to find ways to make them illegal. And our take is, you know, hold up a second, don't make them illegal. Let's find a good working alternative to these type of construction types, and get more housing built. Here's some information about who I am, and feel free to reach out to me at any time.
Thank you, Ed. All right, we will now switch over to Q&A. I'll invite Michael back. So I guess let's go with some audience questions first. So there was 2 questions about elevators and the cost of elevators. I guess, Michael, in one of the ones you showed how it had, you know, multiple elevators per each sort of vertical circulation area, and does it become too expensive when you have to do that? So if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple aspects to this. One, elevator costs, all construction costs in the US are significantly higher than they are in other countries. So it's not just Switzerland, where they're doing these large projects with 8, 10, 20 connected point access blocks, each with their own elevator. You find it in China, you find it in South Korea, you find it in Buenos Aires. And so it's the issue of costs in this country are affecting everything: transit, housing. It's kind of pervasive in how expensive things are here and the quality that you get for them as well. So the cost question, I think, is important. There are folks who are working on trying to find ways to not get around that, but to have our elevator codes be more in line with other countries, and so that they wouldn't be as expensive. For example, Germany, for like mid-rise buildings, doesn't require a full stretcher for their elevators, whereas in Washington State, even if you have a 3-story building that doesn't even need an elevator, if you add an elevator, it's got to be fully code compliant, as if you're doing a mid-rise building or high-rise. And so there are some cost effects that could be reduced with that. But I think the other side of it too, and I tried to allude to this in the slide on the floor plates, we're if you're looking at saving $5 million a floor, and this is strictly hypothetical because we can't do this yet, but if you're saving $5 million a floor over 6 floors, like I said, that's about $28 million, or $4.5 million. It's about $28 million. The cost of those 8 additional or 7 additional elevators is nowhere close to that $28 million. And so you get this this density in those buildings that's like 95% of what you would see in a double loaded corridor, but there's significant cost savings potentially associated with that. And so to me, I think that that's really where the on the connected point access blocks where those savings would come from, or whether there's some way to do that. On the smaller buildings, it's more about, like on a small parcel, it's more about opening up those opportunities. So right now, if I have a 4,000 square foot lot in outside of Seattle where you could only do a 3-story building, there's no need to put an elevator in that whatsoever. And most developers aren't going to, because again, the cost of elevators are really expensive. But that 6-story Habitat for Humanity project in Seattle, it does have an elevator, right? And so it's increasing the number of accessible units. It's opening up more of those opportunities. And so there's kinds of these two realms, I think, where point access blocks start to become really fascinating on the cost side of it. And so, the higher up that we go, I think the more effective those cost savings those costs can be balanced. So if we could do like an 8-story mass timber point access block, in Seattle, like you can do almost any major city in Germany, then I think that those costs start to be balanced and leveraged even greater than they would be now.
Gotcha. Okay. There's a question about international practices and safety benefits versus the cost burden. I don't know if Ed, if you want to take this, or maybe we go back to Michael, because you had a little bit of the European stuff. And basically, like, how did they get there, and why are we different? Is it because that they have these historic buildings that have this layout already, so they're sort of following that, and the U.S. is more so taking those away to build those huge buildings?
So or actually go for it,
No,
Michael.
go ahead. I'll let you start, Ed.
All right. I know a little bit of the history of why we have the second stairway requirement. It actually comes from post-World War II insurance companies trying to underwrite new multifamily construction. And, they're trying to find a code that made sense. So they landed on New York's building code from I think 1902 or something. And the reason that they chose New York was because they hadn't had a major urban conflagration since the mid 1800s. And I mean, since the 1900, New York had only been building out of masonry. So that might have been a reason why we hadn't seen a lot of fires. But, they copied that code, and then that code kind of just stuck in the 60s. Regional codes adopted, a lot of the language from the insurance companies. And then in the 90s, the IBC adopted the regional codes. And the second stairway requirement wasn't necessarily, analyzed.
I was going to say questioned. Nobody questioned it because it had been there for so long. Yeah,
except for New York and except for Seattle, ironically. And I mean,
gotcha.
So, I mean, and I think it's also important to look into the context of American construction. I mean, we hadn't in the United States, at least in LA or in California, we hadn't built a mixed-use building for, say, 60, 70 years. The first 5/1 that I know of, was built in 2003, I believe. And so our mentality towards denser infill hasn't necessarily caught up with I guess the sustained tradition of multifamily development in Europe or in Latin America or Asia.
Gotcha. Mike, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I was going to say, so I think that there are some differences in approach to fighting fires. There are some differences in approach to how buildings are planned and laid out that do affect it. So like most construction in Europe, they don't have an abundance of trees. So right, there's not a lot of wood framed construction. So that is an aspect of it. But with modern materials, we have fire rated assemblies that we can achieve now. We're still able to get that same kind of level of containment. It's also a smaller building. So in a big 5/1, we could have a 50-foot dead end corridor that has as many units on one floor as an entire 5 or 6 story point access block has. So there are, I think, trade-offs to have. I think that the way that we plan our buildings isn't necessarily going to become, it doesn't necessarily result in the greatest outcomes. The big thing too is that we sprinkler every multifamily building in this country. There are almost no sprinkler multifamily buildings in the EU at all. And even in new construction, even if it's mass timber, their approach to it is much more, I don't want to say rational, but it is more, I think, science driven than what we have here in the US, where our codes often aren't necessarily driven by science or data. We're just looking at how things happened in the past, as I'd said, and then just kind of moving on with that. And that's one of the reasons that our building code in Seattle is, what, 2,000 pages, and 50 years ago it was 200 pages. Are our buildings today 8 times safer than they were then? And if they were sprinklered then as well, I don't think so. And so I think that there's some balance that needs to be fleshed out with that.
Yeah. Also, one important thing: liability law.
Yeah. I was gonna say it's all about the liability and like making sure everyone's covered. So rolling into that, there is a question about fire safety features, and if the buildings aren't sprinklered, are there other things as regarding fire safety and egress and those kind of things? I looked at the plans and noticed, like, basically, since you don't have that long corridor, everyone has a really short distance to the stair, so it seems like there is you are safer in that sense, where your unit is much closer to a stair and you have to get out, you can get out that way. But can you talk about that?
Sure. So there are, like you said, there are maximum travel distances. A feature that does not exist or is rarely applied on larger 5/1 developments. Also, the amount of units serving a stairwell core and elevator core is limited, much greater extent than the type of developments that we have today. In Seattle, the stairways are also pressurized, as well as the elevators.
Okay.
I mean, add more stuff, Michael.
No, I mean, I think that's it. It's the travel distance is a big one, the limitation on the units. And so these aren't, you can make massive buildings connecting several of them. In other countries, you can only do it 2 here in Seattle, and I think you can only do 1 in New York City. So it's that much more fine-grained building, but it has like all of the safety components that you would find in a typical 5/1. There's sprinklered buildings, there's fire-rated assemblies. These aren't like atypical to how we develop. This is the way we develop. We're just rethinking the way that we're doing it and doing it at a much smaller scale.
Gotcha. Well, I guess the question is, like, with the double stair, people are always like, oh, well, then you have 2 means of egress. So I guess thinking about how do you address that when you only have the one, the single stair that everyone goes to? Is there stuff like having either ladders or exterior, stairwells or fire escapes and those kind of things that are common, or is that more like depending on how tall the building is?
It's a little bit country dependent. So in Japan, they'll have fire protected balconies. And they do have like little cubby holes where you could climb down a fire ladder to the next level and go down to the next level to get out of the building, which is a very interesting way of doing it for their single stair buildings. But in most of the world, there aren't secondary exits. In Germany, the balcony or window would be considered the secondary means of egress being picked out by the fire department. And it's not like Germany or Switzerland are very risk averse countries, right? I mean, this is where the largest insurers in the world are headquartered. And so there is this weird issue about liability. People talk about it, but I don't think that we think about it in the same way that the Swiss do, or the Germans, or whatever.
And then I usually, when that question is asked, I like to flip it and I say, well, what if you're wheelchair bound or you have a disability?
Yeah, true.
Second staircase is worth as much as the first staircase, right?
Gotcha.
So these single stair layout or vertical shared access, I guess.
Yeah. And I guess you could almost say it's you might actually be promoting safety, because you have that one area of refuge where your neighbors at least are seeing that, hey, there's a person that's there and we need to figure out how we're going to help them get out of the building.
And also the wall fire rating is usually considerably higher in these type of layouts than a 5/1. So the possibility of fire spread is much lower in these laws. And that's redundant too, because we also have sprinklers,
Gotcha. There was a question about the unit sizes, and someone said in Seattle it seems like most are small units. I know, Michael, you did show some that at least we showed some floor plans that had family units, and I don't know if you want to talk about that. You or Ed want to talk about like unit size, because it seems like from the floor plans you showed, that question was an early question, so it seems like you might have addressed that in the presentation, but I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
I think that 95% of development in Seattle is studios or 1-bedrooms. It's really difficult to get the economics of larger units to work out. But what I find interesting, and this is like what we're trying to prove with point access blocks on that Larix on that one project, is that it's feasible and that it's possible. And what is also interesting, like look at the Capitol Hill co-housing project that Ed and I showed, or the Habitat for Humanity project, right? Those have a higher percentage of family-sized units on those sites, and they're small sites. And so I think it's not so much it's really difficult to induce family-sized units in general, especially right now, especially with the cost of construction and all of the other issues that go into development. And I don't understand why that is for the most part, because in Germany, when you do a development, you do a mix of unit sizes. It's not all studios and one-bedroom units. There's a wild diversity in terms of unit mix. And so the questions about how to induce that, I think, are important. But I think that it does allow for more opportunities on smaller parcels. And I think that, having like a 4-story 8-plex with 1 unit on either side, family-sized units, it's totally feasible. It's totally legal. And now that our zoning at the state level has started to change, I think that we'll start to see more projects like that. I'm hoping, anyway.
Yeah, and then if I could add a little bit, I mean, coming from like the planner, public angle, sometimes planners try to be prescriptive and try to say, hey, these new development or developers, you got to build, these family-oriented units, right? But then that immediately clashes on the building code and the built form of developments, and so you get developers that say, well, if you're going to require a certain amount of 2 beds or 3 beds, we're just not going to build the project. It just doesn't make sense. So
Gotcha. So let's jump a little bit to, I know that you guys may not know specifically this, but there are some questions about, since this is a Virginia oriented group, and so we have a large audience population probably that are based in Virginia. There were a couple questions asking about the status of this conversations in Virginia, but also someone who we have an audience member from Whiteville, Virginia, talking about their codes, and are there resources for model ordinances or codes for communities? So I don't know if you all have any interaction with folks in Virginia and advocacy in Virginia, and if you provided any codes for planning departments here at all.
I can take the first part. I saw that Lyle Sola Yates was on the attendees list earlier. Lyle was instrumental in kind of advancing a code modification to allow this in Virginia. I think it was last year, and it didn't get through to the next level. It also didn't get entirely shot down. It sounded like the Code Council was interested in talking about it further. I haven't really been in contact with Lyle or anyone else who's working on that, but I know that there are groups that are working towards it. What's really funny is that this really started with me just writing about it and tweeting about it. And it's kind of become this interesting movement. Like Ed and I are associated with like these larger circles that are all kind of rowing in the same direction, having conversations with cities and states, and now federal legislators as well. So I think a lot of people are looking at the way that we do development in this country is just really not great. It doesn't have great outcomes. And so this isn't, like Ed said, this isn't a silver bullet, but it does start to open up some really interesting possibilities. And so I don't know if Lyle could maybe drop some information in the chat, or if there are other groups, if, it seems like something AIA Virginia or some development groups could also kind of take point on as well. But that's all I have or know on that issue.
And then when it comes to model codes, so my org has written a couple for cities in Southern California. So there might be a little bit a couple differences between Southern California and Virginia, but the means usually lead to the same end. Another important thing to note is that these model codes will be significantly different than existing planning design standards, because today planners design for the double loaded corridor, for the single loaded corridor, and they try to maximize the value out of these setups. They try to squeeze everything they could get out of them. But this different code completely changes the paradigm. It completely changes what can be the amount of open space that could be allowed, the amount of cross ventilation or designs that could be facilitated. And so it just opens up a very interesting conversation how we look into the future of multifamily construction in the US.
Gotcha. So there's a question which I'm not a little sure. There's a one that says Virginia Tech Hokies or University of Washington Huskies. I don't know if that's the reference to the Virginia Seattle dichotomy here, but they actually wanted to know how Virginia compares to Washington in building innovation and infill practices. And then they're also asking about zoning codes and permitting processes, and I guess how easy or difficult it is if you guys have any. Again, going back to if you have any experience or have talked to your colleagues on the East Coast side about those things.
So I'm definitely a Hokie, although my wife is a Husky. Does not cause any issues. So I'm familiar with Virginia. I went to high school in Nova. My family still lives all around DC. I would say that one of the reasons I moved to Seattle is because there's this ethos around nature that I found not as strong in other places. And after being here for 15-ish years, maybe a little bit more, I'm not quite sure that exists, but there is this interesting culture around innovation that I didn't expect. And it's not really, it's not by accident, but it is interesting.
Is that coming from the tech side of Seattle? And
not so much. So like the single-stair thing to me is fairly innovative across the US. We're kind of the most liberal, I guess you could say, with regards to that. But also, like when it comes to mass timber, the Pacific Northwest, specifically the abundance of wood and the value-added wood industry here has definitely driven part of that. We're not building as many mass timber projects as I thought I would, but there are some really interesting projects. There's an affordable housing project that's under construction. There's a couple of taller buildings that are under construction. So that, for me, like I love mid-rise buildings. And so there's some really interesting stuff happening in that space that is starting to permeate through other aspects as well. And Susan Jones, who is an architect here in Seattle at Atelier Jones, was one of the facilitators for getting the mass timber code adoption passed through the Code Council. So those are kind of two of the bigger things. When it comes to like zoning and permitting, everyone looks at us as like being like fairly progressive. We build a lot of housing compared to other cities, but like honestly, like boots on the ground, like being here, the cost of development is heinously high. It's really difficult to get innovative housing to pencil anywhere in the region, not just Seattle. Our land use codes are not great. We're not optimizing the connection between housing and transit either. So I'm not really familiar with so much of the development going on in Virginia. I know more of it around DC, and I'd say DC and Seattle are probably pretty comparable. We don't have the Height Act, so we can build significantly taller buildings. But there are mass timber buildings under construction in DC now. I've had conversations with academics and legislators in DC about facilitating point access blocks there as well. So it feels like things that are slowly kind of congealing towards a more interesting direction. But when that happens, how that happens is another question.
Gotcha. Ed, there was a question about your meeting with local fire officials, and that you had mentioned that when you started the call and someone was asking, can you talk about their specific concerns, and were you able to give them a response, or how those conversations went?
Those are ongoing conversations, and it's most of their concerns just come from this being something completely out of left field, right? I don't think this is a very, very young conversation. And so it's just going to be a matter of, education and, listening to all of their concerns and trying to find a middle ground. So in California, my group sponsored a bill, AB 835. And the fire union almost immediately came out as so 835 would look at or would ask the fire marshal to study and produce results in safety within these type of unit configurations and building configurations. And the fire union immediately came out as opposed because they said, "What is this? This didn't come from our industry. This didn't come from a traditional group. Are you trying to make our buildings less safe?" And over a matter of a couple of meetings and facilitating discussion, they moved to neutral. And I think that's our homework, just talking to fire departments, letting them know what their concerns are, and reaching the common ground and finding ways to facilitate this type of construction that already exists in the United States.
Gotcha.
I think it's,
are you doing like presentations like this to any maybe firefighter groups or safety people in your area? I guess like have these presentations mainly been to like architects and those kind of folks and like developer types, or have you done presentations with, you know, sort of the fire safety folks that also have a say in sort of building codes?
Yeah, so what we do is we have a private, we have a consultant, a fire engineer consultant that helps us navigate this process. They know much more than I do. They cite codes left and right, and you know, it's about getting these people to the table with I guess the firefighters and letting them settle things out. I think Mike has something to say.
Yeah, and I just want to remind folks, if you have any other questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to the rest of the questions. But go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I was going to say with our bill here in Washington State. So I work directly with the senator's office, presenting the idea, talking about Seattle's code, connecting the city's building department with the senator and his staff. They went out and talked to some of the lobbyists for the cities. They talked to the state fire marshal. So there was a dialogue going on. The state fire marshal didn't squash it immediately either. I think that's kind of the approach that I've taken in a lot of the conversations is like, this is already allowed in Seattle. You know, if you're a major city, you have adequate fire flow, you have fire department that can get, you know, to where they need to be in the city in adequate time. The restrictions should generally be the same, right? Like why, this is a huge issue that we could talk about, like building codes, even within the same state, not aligning, you know, what we allow here in Seattle, we can't do in the city directly to the north. The variability on the building code side affects so many issues. It's one of the reasons prefabrication is not taking off to the scale that it should. But having those conversations has seemed somewhat fruitful. On the legislative side, legislators are always interested in talking about this. And like I said, the fire marshal and the fire department here in Seattle have been open to talking to people and what's the word I'm looking for? Basically kind of facilitating how it ended up here and how they approach it. So I think that, you know, for me personally, I would love it to see if we could go 7-8 stories. I think it aligns really well with mass timber and more of our housing goals and everything else. I understand why the limit is 6 stories now, but it would be great to say like, look, Seattle is kind of the minimum that we could do, maybe on a prescriptive level, and then with some performance-based stuff, we could go 7-8 stories and you know, maybe open up more interesting opportunities. But we have to have the codes that will facilitate that.
Michael, there is a question just for folks who may not know some of the terms that you were using in your presentation. Mass timber, social housing, co-housing. Maybe you could go over a couple of those, and then if there's any others I'll think of, I'll add to the list.
Mass timber is it's basically just building with solid elements of wood, cross-laminated timber, dowel-laminated timber. Think of it as like large sticks of wood and really thick pieces of plywood. There are advantages in terms of construction speed, prefabrication, reduced noise on site, disassembly, design for disassembly, circularity. It's kind of a modern way of building. It's been
alternative to steel or concrete.
Exactly. It's in a lot of ways it's a substitute for using concrete or steel. It's been in the works in Central Europe for over 20 years. When I was working in Freiburg in 2003, 2004, we were working on a number of projects with dowel laminated timber, which is basically you take like a bunch of sticks of wood and line them up together, and then they friction fit a hardwood dowel in between to hold it all together. We really only started using that here in Washington. I worked on the first project on the West Coast. That was 2018. So, you know, we're significantly farther behind, but that's starting to become fairly commonplace. And there are mass timber towers now all over the world being proposed. It's kind of like utilized as a means of decarbonization. I'm not totally sold on that yet, but I think for me, it's the quality of construction, it's the speed of construction, and all the other aspects, biophilia, that make it so great. Co-housing is people choosing to live together in their own environment. In Germany, it's generally Baugruppen. People will come together and self-develop their own housing. We've been trying to get this off of the ground in the States for a while as well. But again, construction costs being where they are, and you know, most families that we know are not extremely wealthy, and so we're not kind of at the place where that's economically feasible yet. But it's really about kind of intentional community and dwelling together and looking out for one another. What was the other term?
So in Europe, is that normally one building with multiple units or single building?
It's funny. I'm really good friends with a lot of co-housing architects here in the US, and a lot of our projects, a lot of the projects in the US are rural or suburban. They'll be like detached houses or attached townhouses. But in most of Europe, these are very dense urban buildings. Even in Denmark, where the co-housing kind of really comes from, in the cities, they'll have a dense urban building it's got a mix of unit sizes, it's got a mix of unit types. There's amenities.
There's
normally
some community, like some community, like kitchen or something like that. That's the gathering space.
Yeah, more so in the Danish model, in the German model. And so I'm not a big come together and eat meals every kind of night kind of person. So that's, to me, that's the appeal about Baugruppen. And it's like you get all of the social aspects of co-housing, but then you don't have to have like the common house and all of that. And so instead, maybe it's we have a music room. And we have a bike workshop or something. It's really just a little bit of a differentiation on that regard.
And I think one of the other terms was social housing, which I know people here equate that to maybe like Section 8 or something along those lines, where it's more government subsidized housing. Correct?
Yeah, so social housing, I find it a little bit more all-encompassing. You could have non-profit social housing providers. You could have market rate social housing providers, although they're pretty rare. There are government institutions that provide social housing. It's kind of a catch-all for non-market housing, and co-housing in Austria and Vienna is a form of social housing as well. And so it varies a lot by country, but it's really about again, these intentional, or not necessarily intentional, but these well-run, well-planned, government-assisted housing. And in so many other countries,
not necessarily not profit-based housing, which is what we get in the US. Yeah,
exactly. And the quality, like in Vienna, the quality of their social housing far exceeds like all market rate housing in the US. Like it's just unbelievable what they're able to do, and at the costs that they can do it.
There was one other question about, we had another question. I didn't see that one. There's a question about potential for cost savings. Is the cost savings coming from the reduced overall floor plate or just overall efficiency?
Yeah, in the analysis, and it was a kind of a really quick back of the napkin analysis that we did, the significant construction cost savings more than covered the incremental number of elevators. And that was, like I said, you're still getting like 90 to 95% of the number of residents in that building, but you're saving a ton of floor space, a ton of exterior envelope. You're not building as many kitchens. You're not building as many bathrooms. Another interesting thing that I learned about recently that I meant to bring up in the discussion is that the way that we pipe our plumbing in a point access block is also significantly different. So you can run like pipe and pipe, and you reduce the overall amount of plumbing and fixtures and piping used by like 40%. So it's almost a 50% reduction in that as well. So like I said, there are all of these knock-on effects to how we design our buildings that like we haven't even begun to unravel, because we haven't really started to look at this as outside of anything other than kind of at the superficial level.
Gotcha. Ed, I don't know if you can address this. There's a code question asking about why the 6 stories height limit, I guess, from
Seattle, right? I'm not too sure about that. I think Michael, do you know?
Michael, do you want to address that? And then
do you think it's like a fire ladder type?
Yeah, New York's is the same. It's the 6 stories, and I think that's the apparatus height limit.
The limit that can go. Okay, and then someone was asking, how did it start in Seattle? Like, who brought this, I guess, to Seattle? Was there a specific architect or developer that initiated the change or maybe it was a variance, when it first started?
So I'm not sure. I know when it happened. I don't know why it happened, but the code, the city council here has the power to modify the state building code. And in 1977, they modified it to go from 3 stories of single-stair building to no height limit, which completely blows my mind. It's like, oh my gosh, we're Switzerland. Let's do this. But still requiring sprinklers and fire-rated assemblies and things of that nature.
Gotcha.
I don't know that any projects actually did that, and I haven't had the opportunity to explore that. It would be interesting to find out, though.
I think that's all the questions. I had a question about what I think you all covered, kind of like aesthetics. But I don't know, Ed, you want to start maybe with any closing comments?
You get way prettier, more livable buildings with single stair layouts. They kind of make sense. We should really, really consider into implementing this code.
Michael, any closing comments?
Yeah, so the Surgeon General came out 2 weeks ago with a report on the epidemic of the loneliness and isolation crises in the US. And I look at our built environment, and it's not just cars and sprawl, but how we build our cities and even plan our buildings. Like all of our status quo biases lead to these places where we're kind of self-isolating. We're not going out and meeting people in places that are quiet where we can actually hear them. I feel like our entire built environment needs to radically change to start to address some of those issues. And point access blocks, not the silver bullet to this, but when both of the times that I lived in Germany, I lived in a point access block, my neighbors were right there. I could run across the street to them at any point, or the corridor to them at any point. The most recently in Bavaria, we lived in a fourplex of maisonette units, so 2-story units. And you just go up half a flight of stairs and you're interacting with all of your other neighbors, constantly running into them, constantly having people like, hey, how are you, checking in on you, seeing how your kids are doing. And that I haven't noticed that in larger buildings here in Seattle. It's small buildings and big kind of impersonal, or small units and big impersonal buildings. And for me, point access blocks are how we start to kind of crack that nut just a little bit.
Yeah, I was just thinking when we started this, I was like, oh yeah, I guess I live in a similar building because I live in a garden style condo that's like 3 floors with our 1 stair in between the units. And so very similar. I can see that how I have interaction with my neighbors because they're right across the stair and we all go down that 1 stair in and out of the building. So definitely something that I recognize as a difference in when I go to other people's buildings. And the first time I went into a New York building with the big long corridor and everything like that. So thank you all for bringing the information here. Thank you for Housing Forward for having us and shedding some light on this topic. I hope that our audience members were able to get a lot of great information and take it back to their locales. And maybe we will have a new cadre of advocates for this here in Virginia. So I appreciate that. I think we can head off. I don't know, Jonathan, I think he was at a different spot. So I don't know if Jonathan, if you want to say any closing, because we did have about 5 minutes left.
Sure. Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I'm still here. Thank you all very, very much. This has been awesome and exactly what I expected from each of you. So to everybody in the audience, we will send Ed's and Mike's slides, of course, and we will also make sure that any other information or links or resources that were mentioned in the conversation today are included. If there are any specific things that you have questions about, please feel free to reach out to us or to our panelists directly, since they shared their information. And hopefully we can come back to this topic in a year and see what we've done here in Virginia and see what you guys have been doing out on the West Coast and other places as well. So thanks again, enjoy the rest of your days, and take care.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.